sure hope so. We are, like I told you last week, going to be starting in the next 12 books of the Bible, the books of history, because we have finished talking about of Israel's time in the desert and in the wilderness. Last week we saw how Moses' time on earth was finished and how God told him that it was over and it was time for him to come to be with him in heaven. And he told him who to appoint to be a leader. He told him to appoint Joshua. He allowed him to see the promised land, even though he wasn't going to be able to go in. And he told him to tell the people to be strong and to be courageous. And so now we have come to the time they have spent 40 years in the wilderness, and it is time for them to go into the promised land. They've been waiting for 40 years just outside of the promised land. Well, if you remember, the reason they spent 40 years in the promised not in the promised land, the reason they spent 40 years in the desert, it was because when God had Moses send 12 spies to go look at the promised land, 10 of them came back and said, "It's great, but we can't do it. The people are too big and too powerful." But Joshua and Caleb said, no, we need to go and we need to do this. But the people didn't believe that they could do it. And it described their hearts as melting. They were afraid. Well, it has been 40 years, which was the punishment God gave them for not believing that he would help them. And now Joshua is supposed to lead all of Israel, which just keeps growing, into the promised land. And so what he does is he decides he's going to send 2 people in ahead of them to spy out the land again, just like they did with Moses. And so he takes these 2 guys and he says, I want you to go and I want you to check out the land. Okay? So the 2 guys go in and they get to this land called Jericho, which is a big city. It's going to be the first city that Israel's going to encounter when they come into the promised land. And the cities back then were surrounded by walls that protected the cities. And some places in the walls, they were kind of like hotels, right? Inside the walls were buildings. And so this woman lived in the wall. Her house was in the wall of Jericho, and her name was Rahab. And she wasn't she wasn't a woman of good reputation, because she did things that wouldn't be considered appropriate. Okay, but they came to her and they told her what they were doing. Well, other people in the area heard about these 2 Israelites who were coming, and they went and they told the king of Jericho. They said, there are 2 men of the Israelites here and they're coming to look at the land. And they're with Rahab. And so the king sent some men over to Rahab's house to get these men, but she heard that they were coming, and she hid the 2 men upstairs on the roof. And when the men came, the king's men came to find these men, she said, well, yeah, they were here, but they've already left because it's nighttime and we were closing the gate and they left before that. But if you hurry and chase them, you could probably catch up to them. And so they did. They went to chase after them. And so after those men left, she went up to the roof and she said, okay, guys, they're looking for you, but I told them to go in a different direction. Now, I know who you are, and I know why you're here, because I have heard what your God did. Let me read the verses to you. We're in Joshua chapter 2, and this is what she says. I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that in all the inhabitants of the land have melted away because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water from the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt 40 years ago, and what you did to the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. We've heard about this. We've heard the rumors of who you are. And when we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, He is the God of heaven above and on earth below. When people do what God tells them to do, and God does amazing things, people aren't impressed by you. They're impressed by your God, right? So when we do things for God, it shouldn't make us look good. It should make God look good. And that's what happened here. And the people that the 12 spies 40 years ago were afraid of have said, we've heard about you because we've heard about what your God did, and we are terrified of you. So Caleb and Joshua were correct. If they had gone in 40 years before, the people were afraid of them, and God would have easily defeated them. And so she said, okay, we know who you are, we know why you're coming, and we're terrified of you. And there is no courage left in anyone here. And she said, but what I've done is I've told these men to go chase you over there, and you're not that way. So if you go this way, you'll be okay. She said, but I know you're coming. Just do this one thing for me, she said. Would you please spare me and spare my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters? Would you spare us because we believe in your God? And the 2 spies said, listen, we will do that. We will make an oath with you. We will promise you that if you protect us, we will protect you. And so she let them outside the gate and helped them escape and told them, okay, go that way, and I want you to hide for 3 days so that the people looking for you won't find you before you go back to your people. And they said, okay, here's what we want you to do. We want you to put a red, they called it a scarlet, a red rope, a red ribbon outside your window, and bring everyone you care about into your house, because your house will be protected because of that red ribbon. We will know that that's your house, and we won't attack it. And if we do attack it, the blood of anybody who dies is on us. We're guilty. Okay? But if they leave your house and they get attacked, that's not our fault. And if you tell other people that we're coming, then we don't have to keep our promise to you at all. And she says, okay, I will do that. And so they left her, and they went back to Joshua after waiting 3 days hiding. And they told Joshua this: surely the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and all the inhabitants of the land, moreover, have melted away before us. In other words, it is time. God has gone before us. He's going to fight for us. He's going to do it. Can you imagine how excited they were to hear how scared the people were of their God, and how God's reputation had gone before them, and that someone who was not a believer in God protected them and kept them safe, and that they were going to get a chance to protect her and her family? Do you know, we're going to find out later on when we read the story, when they do go in, they do protect Rahab, and Rahab becomes a believer, and she becomes a part of the family that Jesus will be born from years and years and years from then. Isn't that cool? God's promise is for anyone and everyone who will listen. And we know what God's promise is, that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, the sins of anyone who would believe. But we have to accept the sacrifice that he made for us. We have to tell other people about him and what he's done. And you know who's afraid and whose heart has melted before God today? Satan's. Satan knows he's defeated. He knows that Jesus died on the cross and rose again. He knows that the battle is over. Even if it looks like we're still fighting, we're not, because the actual battle for good and evil has already been won, and Jesus won it. And aren't you excited that you know who Jesus is? Aren't you excited that you know the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who helps us in everything? Doesn't that make you strong and courageous? I hope so. This is a short story, but it's a very, very good one, isn't it? Well, I will look forward to seeing you next week. And we're getting closer and closer to seeing each other in person, and I cannot wait. Have a wonderful week. I'll see you